The Guardians, Path of Ascension, by Bruce R.F. Chapter 5, Hunger Pains. Enveloping him, it wraps its leafy extremities, vine-like as they are, around his limp, almost lifeless body, while nestling firmly close to his flesh, like the giant squid that entangled Captain Nemo's submarine. It feeds on his very living essence, as he lays helpless, trapped within the vessel of his own comatose body. He feels no pain, and although he is consciously unaware of the danger, a lingering presence exists in his mind. Flashes of red and black flood his dreams, with images of a terrifying creature. It stands like a man, though its movements are shifty and awkward. It shuffles as it walks, swaying from side to side, and has greenish-brown coloring like a lizard. Yet its limbs are twisted and tangled, with layers of tightly wrapped foliage, fluttery and leafy, like a tree, with sharp, tooth-like thorny protrusions, where a mouth should be. Seldin curses at it harshly, shouting obscenities in an attempt to summon up anger from deep within himself, burying his fear and converting it into something more useful. The energy pushes out from the core of his being, radiating through his skin and into his aura. With a grunting groan he heaves, generating a defensive matrix, but the creature does not budge. It latches on even tighter than before, allowing itself to be bathed in the energy he freely gives up, unintentionally feeding its raging and undying hunger. And that's how it went for a while. For several days now, he has experienced this hellish limbo, unable to escape. The entity continues to feed, bringing him to the brink and back, over and over, but it won't kill him. Instead, it brings him to within an inch of his life, then releases its grip just long enough for him to regain strength, so that it can start feeding again. But then, it stops. As the rain comes and the weather changes, the air grows colder. The sunlight recedes from the crest of the canopy overhead, as clouds steadily move in, bringing the whooshing roar of the downpour, spewing forth tiny sparkling beads that pelt the trees and the surrounding vegetation, while filling the air with an intense rumbling rhythm that drowns out the majority of the ambient woodland sounds. And for the first time in days, Seldin's eyes open as he awakens to the cool sensation of drops running down his face, clinging to what feels like a week's worth of growth. He looks up at the falling rain as he rises from his back and then presses his right hand into the moistened soil beneath him, using what strength he has to reach a half-seated position. His eyes then catch the first real glimpse of the terrible attacker, the thing that has kept him hostage these last few days. It isn't a giant squid, or even a ferocious plant monster for that matter. In fact, there's nothing frightening about it, just a tiny rose flower rooted to the middle of his chest, with a white ball of fluff like a dandelion in the center of its blooming bulb. As he goes to touch it, the flower twitches and startles him. The bulb then closes up, while the vine-like roots retract, and the small plant drops off, falling into his lap. He reaches behind himself, slinging his duffel bag to his side, and quickly pulls out a jar with a sewing needle suspended from the inside of the lid by a string. Popping the jar open, he removes the trinket, packs in a few handfuls of moistened dirt, then quickly sets the flower inside. "What the hell are you?" he asks aloud, examining it through the glass. A clap of thunder then steals his attention with an ear-shattering boom that soon fades, swallowed up by the sound of the rain. He knows he can't stay out here, cold and soaked to the bone, and sitting in almost an inch of mud. Food and shelter are his priority now, for he'll need to regain his strength before he can press on. His curiosity will have to wait. Putting his things in his bag, he then looks for a place to shield himself from the weather. This little patch of woods is pretty big for what it is, about 100 acres or so, and the closest thing to being in the wilderness he has ever been. Woods this thick don't come often in Florida where he grew up. But this isn't Florida. Virginia, maybe? Or perhaps one of the Carolinas. Seldin isn't sure. The distance gone and the time traveled are still a blur, and it doesn't help that he stayed off the main roads. No state signs, at least none that he can recall seeing. With his head still in a fog, and the rain still hitting hard, he feels it's best to simply wait it out. He spends the bulk of that first day hunkered under a narrow cliff face that protrudes out some 15 feet from the side of the mountain's west wall. It serves as good cover, and not far from there is a river that brings, or so he hopes, a potential food source. With fruit scarce and berries uncertain, he refrains from trying the unknown, but he'll have to venture out soon. The provisions he packed have withered during his unconsciousness. They're no good for anything now, except maybe bait. Seldin thinks for a while about what might be out there, what sort of traps he can set. Though he wouldn't dare kill anything himself, hunger can be a powerful motivator. Still, he just can't bring himself to do that just yet, but soon he might have to. For the most part, he feels his time in the wilderness is going well, despite his run-in with a carnivorous plant. His worst experience so far was answering the call of nature, but he managed. Resting for a while, Seldin naps nude to the sound of the rain and the rhythmic drumbeat of the thunderous storm. His wet, muddy clothes sway on the drying line he brought along and stretched across the crevice where he hides. There isn't much to do with the way things are, except rest up for the long trip ahead. He still has a ways to go yet, and he can only guess at how much power he has lost. Physically he feels fine, a little tired, groggy, but he fears his energy reserves are drained, sucked dry by a ravenous flower, which lay shriveled and unblooming in the jar across from him. He can barely move the needles in the other jars he brought along for telekinetic practice. Normally he can make them point to him, like the hand of a compass, aligning in the Earth's magnetic field, but he can barely make them jiggle now, with the ether in his meridians so low. Opening his eyes, he peeks out at the flower, with its bulbous bud slumped over a thorny stem that rests against the inside of the jar, enshrouded by the frosted presence of condensation. He wonders why it won't bloom, and it hasn't, since it dropped off the day before, or the night thereafter, and now. Perhaps it's a lack of sun, the thought occurs to him. Flowers rarely bloom in gloom. Then again, it isn't the sort of thing that you'd find at the local florist. Standing just long enough to take a few steps forward, Seldin brushes the sand and grit from his backside, then kneels by the container, sitting on the edge of a stone slab, and he gently taps at the glass in an attempt to rouse it. He then scoffs at himself. It's just a plant, he comments at his own actions. For a moment he expected it to move, but why would it? Shaking his head, he turns about, heading back to the comfort of his spot. Then, a barely audible single tap catches his attention. As he looks back to check, he is amazed at what he sees. One vine-like root has reached out and touched the stain of his fingerprint, pressing up against it from the inside of the container. Tapping at it a second time, he runs his index finger along the outside of the jar. The little rose follows suit, mimicking him in his motion. He laughs, unable to hold in his astonishment. He then pulls his finger back and goes in for a third attempt, which yields a similar result. It follows him every time, attracted to the heat of his body and his energy. After a few minutes, his curiosity eventually wavers with a deep yawn, and he steps back into his corner, taking a seat on the hard ground with his legs crisscrossed beneath him. He places his hands on his knees, and then leans back against the wall as he begins to take deep, relaxing breaths, allowing his abdomen to expand and contract as he sinks into a restful meditation. Through his mind's eye he looks inward, following the flow of his energy, as he directs it from the recesses of his abdomen, then up his spine with his consciousness, which weakens as he drifts off to sleep. Is this legal? Almir whispers, peeking over the brawny shoulders of his new mentor to the coin machine in the far corner of the store. Leon responds with only a sideways glance. It wasn't a hard question, but he needs to stay focused for this to work. Legal or not, it's about the challenge. His eyes then fall back to the task at hand, and the reciprocating motion of the plate pushing the mountain of quarters forward. He doesn't need to grab them all, just one. Allowing his body to relax, Leon extends his mind down into his core. His hands are poised, with his palms and his focus aimed through the glass. A deep breath pulls air in, until a sensation of pressure and warmth form at his center. He can feel it building, moving through his body, and the glass resisting his intent. Cha-ching! The bells ring and the buzzers sound, with a jolly siren of a winner as he collects his booty. Seldin teach you that? Almir asks, with a look of amazement. Not exactly, Leon replies, with a bloated, prideful grin, as they leave the confines of the convenient mart. So when are you going to let me meet this Seldin guy anyway? The youngling pesters, though he's not much younger than Leon. When you're ready, he answers, with a hint of smugness in his voice as they walk. Leon has always looked up to Seldin. For the longest time, he strived to be exactly like him, perhaps even to the extreme. The same clothes, the same haircut, and for a while, he even donned a similar nickname. But now, with his best friend gone, Leon has taken to finding his own way, and with that, his own student. Out of nowhere comes a young, though familiar voice. Hey Lee, you better get home. Dad's been looking for you. Both Leon and Almira glance at the little brother, approaching from the left. He's not our dad, Chad. The sooner you realize that, the better, Leon says, as they continue to walk past him. I'm gonna tell him you said that, the 12-year-old replies, as he enters the store. The teens then head off to practice at their favorite park, as they typically do, entering into their daily ritual of partial concussions and deep bruises. The brutality of their antics drives their strength to new heights each day, and without Seldin, Leon is determined more than ever to surpass him, to become a guardian in his own right. Exchanging blows, Leon does what any good teacher should for his student. He demonstrates the value of his lessons through application. Hurrah! Almir grunts, as his shin just grazes past the head of his opponent, who ducks out of the way. Leon returns swiftly, rolling out of the dodge, and ricocheting off his right palm, launching into a one-handed mule kick that connects as he counters. Remember, attack and defense simultaneously, Leon instructs, springing to his feet. Almir pops out of a kip-up and charges at him, attacking from a standing sweep with his left leg, followed up by his right, switching off one after the other, while Leon casually steps out of each move. Smack! A beet red hue anoints Almir's face, forming the shape of a palm. You're looking at my feet. Keep eye contact at all times, and use your peripheral vision for targeting. If you look where you strike, you narrow your vision and give yourself away, Leon says, twisting Almir while dodging a punch that clips the random peaks of his buzzed hair. With a swift push, Almir goes forward, stumbling to regain his balance, and once he does, he drops into a perfect horse stance, then motions carry Tiger to the mountain as he pushes his hands outward, then up 30 degrees, with his palms formed in tiger claw. Leon rests in his stance, offering a prickish smirk, and then lowers his eyes, while giving a shake of his head. "You're doing it, Ra." He then notices the shift in the air. "Oh, you're learning," he says with pride. Almir's core is heating up, and Leon can feel his power growing. "Steady it. That's good," Leon says, then shifts his rear foot, bending his knees slightly as he begins to concentrate to match his student. Staring each other down, the two relish in the excitement of the challenge. For Leon especially, there's something about passing one's knowledge on. He wonders if this is what Seldin felt all that time. With his posture ready, he leaps forward. Seeing his teacher charging at him, Almir's mind races. If only he would look away, he thinks to himself, hoping for a perfect opportunity. Leon then pushes energy ahead of himself to cushion the shoulder ram into Almir's guarded stance. But then, abruptly, he stops, feeling an overwhelming urge to gaze over his shoulder. Immediately, Almir does a quick hop left, turns himself 90 degrees, and places his palms out. There is a low, muffled boom, like a firecracker exploding underwater, as he releases his storage. It isn't much, but it's enough to surprise his mentor and provide an opportunity for a knee to the gut. Leon falls, defensively rolling a short distance, and then rests on his knees to regain his wind, which had been knocked out of him. Working to conceal his breathing, Leon is tapped out. That one well-placed blow numbed him good. For a moment, as Almir presses on with his attack, Leon is lost in uncertainty. As if coming from instinct, Leon slaps his hands to the ground. Suddenly the earth shakes and cracks beneath Almir, who is hoisted upward. "Whoa! What did you do?" Almir gasps, clinging to the 12-foot-tall rocky spire that had somehow sprouted out of nowhere. Pulling his hands away from the base of the pillar, Leon stares at his soiled, sweaty palms, the sensation of ether still present within them. "I don't know," he replies. Sleeping off the remainder of the day before, and clear through the night, Seldin wakes feeling somewhat refreshed. His attempt to meditate wasn't a complete failure after all, it seems, as a portion of his strength has returned. The breathing exercises just before he nodded off must have set up alternating micro and macro cycles of energy, necessary for realigning his flow, he thinks, for he can feel the power in his meridians. It feels good to be in tune with things again. Internal alignment is crucial for these abilities to work, if even at such a small degree. He knows exactly where he is now, able to affix his bearings, and feel the Earth's magnetic field and the clearness of his mind. He isn't at 100% just yet, but even the rose can feel his renewed strength, for it too is awake, in full bloom, perked, poised, and ready. If it had eyes, its casual gaze would be a stare, cast from the parabola of its petals. Seldin gets up sprightly to greet his little companion, teasing with a finger. "After breakfast, my friend," he says, peeking out at the gray sky from the confines of his crevice. "There are some experiments I'd like to try." He then pulls his clothes off the line. At least, it's lightened up a bit. He steps out, sloshing through the soggy landscape of fallen foresty debris. The little bit of light coming through leaves radiant beams of brilliant gold, which stream, slightly angled toward their origin in the sky. A veritable kaleidoscope before him, he reserves a moment for the spectacle on his morning forage, smiling at the sight of its awesomeness. The subtle break in his pace awards his senses with a narrow trail, just off kilter of his initial direction. Looking there, he decides to follow. Seldin maps the area mentally, keeping a tether on his camp, which he focuses on like a beacon, so as to not lose his way. Whoosh, swoosh, the leaves of fronds and various shrubs fan past him, with violent, springy rebound, as he brushes them aside to clear his path. They sprinkle beads of wetness that chill his skin, despite the rain, and the ominous hazy forest fog. With his stomach growling, he continues moving through the woods, and in the distance, he hears a rolling, roaring tide. Excited, he takes to a sprint, before entering into a clearing and stopping just before the edge of the bank. His eyes widen at the magnificence of the energetic rapids that slap the rocks protruding from beneath the water's surface. Hearing a rumble from within, he kneels, peering through the rushing rapids in hopes of a morsel, when a sudden crack from above brings down the heavy rain once again. Cold and already soaked, his shivers draw no comfort from the emptiness of the water. Sadly, he relinquishes a breath of disappointment, unable to forage any farther, for the weather has stolen any chance of satisfying his hunger. With the little strength he has, he concentrates, drawing in the ether, in an effort to shield himself in a blanket of warmth, as he meanders back to camp, all the while pondering the prospect of food. With his mind filled to the brim, he takes a seat, with his back resting against the stony slab that supports his little companion. "Girl. So hungry," he moans, along with his stomach, which he cups with a hand to muffle the growl. Suddenly, he hears a clanking sound just off to his right, and finds the jar rolling up beside him. Bringing it to eye level, he offers the flower a quaint, dissatisfied smile. "You're hungry too, aren't you, little fella?" His eyes follow the enchanting rhythm of the plant's swaying motion. A single viney structure presses up against the glass, reaching for him, squeegeeing the inside of the container. "I'm sorry. I just don't think I have enough energy to share," he says, while tracing a finger over the jar and following the motion of the little vine. Unscrewing the cap, he presents a finger. The plant's bud blooms at the introduction of fresh air. Seldin touches the petals, then the stem. The flower stays placid, swaying contently. "Nah, you can tell there's none left, can't you?" he asks, without really expecting an answer. Wham! It latches on, and he drops the jar immediately, startled as he is. It only held on for a brief second, yet it was enough. Scurrying away, he steps back and stares at the organism. The last time it touched him, it left him drained and in a weakened state. Yet for all the excitement, he feels all right. Cautiously and slowly he inches his way back into his den, while peering around the stony structure. Out from the base stretches a single root-like vine that gives a hint to that which hides around the corner. As Seldin steps closer, he kneels, taking up the container. Clink echoes the glass as it grazes the hard floor. The sound causes the plant to flicker, and he jumps back. "Damn it!" he huffs a startled breath, before braving the distance with a leap forward, pouncing over the rock as he slams the jar down, like catching a fleeing mouse. "Gotcha!" He smirks proudly in his success, while carefully scooping the rest of the rose into the jar, before firmly securing the lid. Catching his breath, he sets the jar down, and then peers out into the wetness of the woods, scanning for signs of life. "If I don't find food soon, there won't be anything left of me for you to eat," he mumbles with a glare back to the rose. Venturing out once more despite the rain, he decides to forage for materials. The stream he saw earlier had no fish to fry, literally, and he knows that unless he's willing to eat his own arm, he'll have to try something else. Picking up strands of vine as he goes, he braids them to the spare lengths of line from his pack, then loops one end of it around a branch of a tree. Seldin then draws the line tightly before covering it with leaves and placing bits of his rancid leftovers in position. Making a face of the rotting sandwich, he scowls. "Ironically, you are what you eat," he chuckles lowly, before fashioning a few more snares. He places each only a few paces from camp, though far enough to keep his scent away, or so he hopes. "Now, I wait," he says, marching back to his crevice. Sitting in his usual corner, Seldin stares at the plant for a few seconds, and then once again attempts to meditate, for it is the only training his body can endure, given its strength. As the breathing cycles start, he begins to feel relaxed. On the inhale, he counts to 4 seconds, while on the exhale, he counts to 6, until the rhythm becomes natural, and he can focus on the flow of his energy. Like a beacon, he opens himself up to his surroundings, allowing the life around him to be felt, as the pull of their auras tugs against his own. So, there are animals here, his mind discovers, seeing intuitively what his eyes could not. But there is something else that he can feel, a force stronger than the neighboring wildlife, and it's right in front of him. With a shocking gasp, he opens his eyes, overwhelmed by what he sees. The light of the land shimmers with brilliant violet hues, which appear to tint all that is visible, like the shades he'd wear on a bright summer day. There are animals and plants all around him, familiar in design, yet distinct enough for him to know something's out of place, namely him. He stands in the heart of the plains, that span for miles, to a backdrop of a mountainous landscape. In the distance, there are structures of a sort that stretch so tall they could likely touch the sky. And as his gaze follows the trail of a towering peak, his eyes widen at the massiveness of the neighboring body. A moon, perhaps. It's so much larger in his view, while silhouetting a glaring spectacle, adjacent of the mass, and shining through from just behind, blindingly so, despite the purple haze, with greenish rays of a star that gives life to the system. Seldin simply cannot believe it. What a wonderful dream! With lucid thoughts dancing in his mind, he takes the scene in as an experience to be had, and like a child, he races toward one of the enormous mounds of what looks like spires of papier-mâché. In spite of his excitement, he finds himself remarkably rejuvenated in this place, for each unlabored breath he takes as he runs empowers him with the heavily enriched, oxygenated air. It's clean, virtually unpolluted, while the gravity that anchors him makes him feel light and free. He could easily jump 40 feet, and land just as softly. When he finally reaches the area that he can only describe as a village, he pauses in search of any patrons. With none in sight, he approaches one of the many adjoining constructs and touches the outside wall. It has a grainy texture, a secreted resin of a sort, akin to that of a termite mound or a wasp nest, with a seemingly cool metallic feel. Suddenly, there's movement from his side, and he jumps defensively at the sight of the gigantic creature to his left. It's nearly twice his height, with a slightly elongated body. Standing on 4 legs, it's insect-like in appearance, with its remaining 2 limbs positioned at its front, like arms. It has large, almost front-facing eyes, antennae, and a carapace with a skin that ripples almost fluid-like as the being moves. The wasp-like beast approaches him, and as his heart sinks in the fear of it, Seldin backs away. "What are you?" he asks. "Suka." A sound echoes within his mind. Astonished, he utters a response. "Did you bring me here?" he asks of it. It nods. "Why?" It then slinks forward, looking into his eyes, and with a gentle upturn of its right forelimb, it extends a finger-like digit, and then presses it briefly over his left breast. The Suka then breaks its gaze, looking upward and past him. Seldin then turns, looking up and back over his shoulder. At first, he doesn't know what it's looking at, but then he sees them, through the overcast sky. Pods, endless pods, falling from the heavens, like seeds of a dandelion blowing in the wind. They corrupt everything they touch, rooting into the ground as they land, while tormenting the unfamiliar forms that he sees there. Ravenous and unrelenting, the sprouts that spawn from the spores overrun the world and feed on the life of whatever they encounter. The Suka's eyes widen in the chaos, and then it looks to Seldin. With a flick of its wrist, it fires off a spine, like the quill of a porcupine. Seldin turns to defend himself, and as he does, the spine grazes his shoulder, stabbing through the heart of a spore. Stunned, he offers a surprised look of gratitude before joining in the fight. Within minutes, the surrounding vegetation has been replaced by these new things that resemble what was once there, despite being of something else. Where tranquility once stood is now war, as the Suka's brethren scurry to the surface from their burrows to combat the menace. Futile the attempt, for soon it is Suka pitted against Suka. Their fallen have risen, as the spores that latch on drain them of their very life force, and then copy their form. This new breed holds their own, despite being plant-like. The spores grow to resemble their host, taking their strength and nearly tripling it. The overrun is fast. Seldin does what he can to fight, dodging the spores left and right. He charges his body like an electric eel. The spores that touch him seem to relish in doing so, unfettered by his defensive matrix. Although he is able to brush them off, each still sprouts into an opponent like no other. They look like him, and worse, can hurt him with his own skills. A great teacher once told him that his fiercest enemy would be himself, and these things are putting that to the test. They have no weaknesses to speak of, and possess overwhelming and unwavering strength. He combats them fiercely, employing every asset that he has, and every technique he's ever learned. Though try as he might, they have no joints to lock, no bones to break, and the limbs he manages to tear from their viney bodies grow back almost as quickly. While the saplings that spawn from his fallen friends are easier to blemish than those that come from him, his brute force method yields little result against their numbers, and those he manages to welt soon heal, only to join the fight again. To make matters worse, the benefits of his strength, which he draws from the atmosphere, seem to pass on in the spores that attach to him. Regardless, he starts to believe his strength to be the reason the Suka brought him to this place, for he is stronger than the natives, and that must give them hope. Dropping to his knees, Seldin plants himself, grabbing at the dirt. He then looks to his companion before clasping his hands together, inverting the orientation of his palms, so that his fingers point inward in opposite directions, purposely misaligning his poles. He then begins to push ether into his hands, slowly sliding his palms across one another as he chants, "Hanai." His hands begin to heat up intensely. He sandbagged this technique for good reason. It's slow and it's taxing. Yet as the power builds, and his hands start to burn, the air around them ripples with waves of heat. He feels it's ready, though not a moment too soon, for a doppelganger charges at him. "Spiha!" he chants loudly, slapping his palms on the chest of the beast, as it releases the energy in a bright beam of light. The creature shrills and stumbles back, clasping itself, as its leafy skin turns white from the intense radiant glow. Seldin smiles at its apparent dismay, but as the light dims, the monster glares at him, then exhales a steamy breath before licking its thorny teeth. "Oh, shh." It rears back, thrusts its hands forward, and then projects a beam that strikes him to the ground, knocking him into a daze. Seldin then looks up at the mistake he had made as it stands over him, ready to use the strength that he gave it. It stares into him, despite its lack of eyes, and he can hear a terrible thing projected into his mind. Its thoughts are primal, unorganized, yet he can sense another presence within the creature, a mind separate, though interconnected, and in control. He shudders in an attempt to block out the images that come through. In that moment, he feels a tear into his chest, and with a howl he exclaims, "But it's just a dream!" His mind fades. "I shouldn't feel the..." With a shrieking gasp, he clutches his chest, crying out in agonizing fright. The shock to his consciousness plunges him awake, in the crevice where he dozed. A sigh of relief flees his quivering lip, then his gaze falls to the rose across the way, still sitting on the stony slab where he left it, with its bud blooming intently at him. "What the hell are you?" Crash! There's a loud crack off in the distance. The noise startles him, making him jump at first, in the midst of his already risen anxiety. But then, as he realizes the nature of the noise, his heart flutters with excitement as his stomach growls. Darting out of his dwelling, he races at top speed. Yes! Finally! He cheers, just as he comes upon it, over a shy hill, and through a set across trees. But then, his wide grin transitions into a grimace. Although his stomach rejoices in his discovery, he suddenly grows opposed to the idea. A fox? He pants. Oh man, I don't know if I can do it. It's too much like a dog. Why couldn't it have been a rabbit or a rat? At least then I wouldn't feel as bad. Well, maybe. His mind wanders as he inches up to the small, red and white bundle of fluff that whines and kicks at the snare, entangling its hind legs. Reaching down to it, he jumps back as it snaps defensively at him. Kill it! He hears from a voice and sees flashes of the rose. I can't. He pushes out the thought. Kill it! He hears again, even louder this time. No! He shouts, fighting the images of thorny teeth and vine-like limbs. With his hunger compounding and his instincts high, he knows he needs it, needs what it has. You have to survive, the voice says. Succumbing to the wisdom and influenced by a deeper yearning, Seldin kneels, pinning the animal with his left hand, just behind the neck and away from its snapping jaws, while forcing its face into the ground. With his other hand, he grasps the nape. He sighs, surprised at just how soft the fur is. Pausing to caress the feathered locks, Seldin feels a shift in his heart as he starts to apply pressure. The animal squeals as he does so, which chills his bones. His sympathy takes hold, and he backs away. Whoa! He tries to dodge, as the fox lunges and snaps his hand. Gah! He moves to a safer distance, while cradling the painful bite. Even with the adrenaline and the need to feed, Seldin resists the urge to strike back, for it was only defending itself. I can't. He lets out a whimper, in a soft, saddened breath. I can't! Fiendish images push into his mind, forced in from the unknown. Seldin wrestles with him, pitted against survival and humanity. He flails wildly, stumbling as his foot locks with the roots of the forest floor, sending him headlong into a rocky protrusion. Kill it! The voice commands, even louder than before, and Seldin opens his eyes. The pain kicks in the moment he sees the creature leering over him, with thorny claws gouging his chest. Grabbing at the arm-like aperture, he uses all his might to force it back. Kill it, Seldin! We need you to fight! We need you alive! But I don't know how! He lets out, baffled, for all his attempts seem in vain. And then he sees it, a white mass, like a ball of cotton, entombed in a wall of vines, just beneath the leaves of a false sternum. He wonders how he'd missed it before. All that time it had been there, like a heart that all the extremities are tied into. In that fleeting thought comes a flash of recollection of how the Suka's spiny barb had succeeded earlier. Seldin slips the monster's arm aside with a snaking motion of his wrist, and then spears his hand up through the veil of leaves, feeling for the mass, as thorns and vines crowd in and grow longer in its defense, attacking his fingers. Pushing through despite the pain, he grits his teeth, and with each pounding beat of his own heart shaking him, he wraps his fist around the spore, soft and fragile as it is. Immediately it falls dead, and the body of the plant withers before his eyes. Although this one victory is a triumph, he feels pity for his fallen foe, and sorrow for what he's done. Sadly for him, there is no time to forgive himself. The line ahead is long, and the next enemy is on its way. Empowered with this new knowledge, Seldin slowly stands, bearing a remorseful grimace. He hates the idea of what he had to do, necessary or not. Pulling the ether from his surroundings, he draws it into his muscles. Although direct energy seems useless against his enemy, he believes that this alternate approach just might work. His very next punch tears through the relatively soft exterior of the creature, like butter. It falls quickly. The following few drop as well, and much like their comrades, they wither as the energy they had stolen spills out of them. One by one they drop like flies. Seldin's renewed strength seems to be tipping the scale in the Suka's favor, for now he can defeat them within 2 strikes or less. He swats the spores that touch him as easily as mosquitoes in the summer's eve, giving them no chance to sprout. Making headway, the defenders press on, turning the tides of battle. The apparent victory, however, weighs heavily on Seldin's heart. As a fighter, he loves to win, yet at what cost? In his childlike naivete, he struggles to balance the world, a peace for all. But he can't befriend them, not after all they've done. Still, with each falling foe, he feels an ever-growing sense of anguish that fuels each devastating blow. Without warning, a shadow falls over the land, blanketing the world in darkness, as the second wave swarms in like locusts. The skies fill with flailing bodies plummeting toward the ground, like paratroopers dropping in. They swoop as they land, generating a cushioning billow of thrust by flapping the enormous petals, resembling a bisecting pair of butterfly wings, which stem from a blossom rooted to the small of their backs. As each of them touches down, The flowers that ease their descent retracts, shrinking down to about the size of a hibiscus blossom. Although these creatures look not all that dissimilar from the other monsters in the horde, right away, Seldin can tell that these are different in overall design. The layering of the leaves and vines cover the body more accurately and much denser, with thorns that run along the vines, as if to wrap around and trace an underlying form of muscle and bone. Unlike their counterparts, their bodies are solid. Their movements are purposeful and strategic. They're able to anticipate his actions and counter his techniques. These new things encircle him. Having seen his earlier success, they want him stopped. Or more to the point, they want him dead. Seldin punches one of them in its elongated face, which looks like the closed bud of a flower. His strike doesn't penetrate the leaves. Instead, the thorns cut his knuckles. Jumping back to parry, he draws in more energy, then tries again, with a similar result. His Suka friend isn't faring much better. Its bladed arms hardly cut them, and its barbs barely gouge. While gathering energy together, Seldin strikes again, this time with a volley of maneuvers to everything he knows to be major in a humanoid form. Face, throat, solar plexus, groin. All of his efforts leave him shredded. What the hell am I fighting, a cactus? A baffled thought races in his mind as he looks over his wounds, but then it hits him, literally, when a sharp, stabbing pain enters his shoulders from behind, raking the skin as if with a steel brush. Gah! He rears back as he drops to his knees from the pain, then rolls to break from its grasp and take its leg with a sweep before the others rush in. Although their hands are oddly shaped, having only 2 fingers and a stub palm, retractable spines on the underside give them one hell of a piercing grip. As the one creature falls from the sweeping of its leg, Seldin kips up and leaps straight into the air, using the weak gravity to his advantage, avoiding being touched again. Come on, Sai. There's gotta be something you can do, he talks to himself. This place enhances my abilities. Maybe if I... Dear God! He looks up, reaching the height of his ascension. For the first time he sees it, the source of all the madness. It has a metallic luster, yet it's organic in appearance. The large, zeppelin-like form stretches for miles, with an even greater floral body hovering in the distance beyond it. He can see even more of them entering the atmosphere, each carrying thousands, maybe even millions of these foliates. In that brief moment, he loses all hope of winning, for the ships in the distance open up and unfold their petals, fanning them outward to dangle the spore-spewing appendages over the land. Looking down at the world as his ascent begins to decline, he catches a glimpse of his friend being overrun. No! He shouts. Fearing the worst, he pulls energy, then expels it, pushing himself like a rocket as he falls toward the vicinity of the Suka. Barreling forward, he aims himself at an enemy, then rams it into the ground as they collide. Seldin then springs forth with all his fury, pulling energy from around himself to aid his strength as he swings on the next foe. It dodges and blocks until a fist strikes with blinding speed, tearing the foliage from its face. And there, beneath the layers, is something Seldin did not expect. A long black eye that curves around the smooth gray skin of a different face. At first glance, he thinks it's a snake, yet it sneers at him while squinting from the light and showing its rows of rounded teeth. Before he can react, the creature strikes him with the back of its hand across his face, tit for tat, knocking him back. As Seldin's eyes close, he catches a last glimpse of its face as the leaves regrow to shroud it once again. Gasping, Jasra clutches her throat as she wakes from a terrible nightmare, letting out a heart-pounding, ear-piercing scream. It takes her a second to realize where she's at. Ghosted images linger in her view. What was that? She asks herself, attempting to put the pieces together. Her eyes then meander, falling back to an empty room. If only he'd come to bed, she sighs sadly, before reaching to her nightstand for one of her many watches. Beep, beep, she sets it back down, disappointed. I guess he's not coming back tonight. She shakes her head, listening to the sounds of his tools coming from the other room as she lies back, staring up at the darkened ceiling. The blackness acts as a backdrop for the images, which seemingly project, as if mentally, in her field of view. She sees clouds billowing and fire encasing a large, cigar-shaped body that penetrates the atmosphere with immeasurable force. It then opens up, fanning out its petal-like structures as the clouds melt away and it draws in the light of the sun. Dear God, what is this? She rubs her eyes, pushing out what she thought was a terrible dream, and then the woeful gaze of a friend catches her sight. The scene in her mind draws back, as if to dolly out like a camera, offering a full view of the well-built man in white garb, hovering before her. She barely recognizes him at first, but her heart flutters in knowing who it is, and she offers a comforting hand to his shoulder as he stares out at the vessel, facing away from her. Her hand presses into the fabric, feeling the detail of the material and the firm muscle that lies beneath, as if he were really there. Sigh? Her voice trails in a paralyzing moment of disbelief, but then the tears in his eyes soften her beats as he glances back to her. I'm sorry, he says. Seldin doesn't wake back in his crevice. Instead, his eyes open to a tan-colored, oval-shaped den. The texture of the papier-mâché walls teases the light as the shadows cast from the rolling flames of the fireplace blanket them in amber hues. Upon his chest is a familiar little flower, which seems to dance in a sort of swaying cadence, following the fire. The Suka creature looks over him. It doesn't speak, though it never had in the most common sense. Carefully assessing the boy's limbs, it moves around him. With Seldin's wounds mended, the alien scoops up the little flower, then sets it down with the other 5 across the room. Seldin sits up to get a better view at them, each identical to the one he found in the woods. Malnar. He hears the sound echo from within, as visions of various plants come to him. Then he hears another word, Malosa, and the creature gestures to the flowers. So, this is where they come from? He asks in an almost rhetorical tone, before an image of the adjoining world flashes in his mind. He closes his eyes as more information pours in. 2 worlds, tethered to each other like the moon and the earth, fill his mind with a view of their elliptical orbit around a bright green star. While there are other planets in the system, these 2 are the only ones with life. The concept of a binary orbit intrigues him. It fuels his curiosity, stirring in more questions, which are followed up almost immediately by more answers, more images. The sister worlds are aware of each other, and as such, share in a symbiosis that has allowed the inhabitants to coexist peacefully for millions of years. The relatively short proximity to one another makes it easy for the 2 dominant species to migrate. Rather than building technology, however, they grew it, evolving and altering themselves to suit their needs. Until the day the Pulsari came. The Pulsari! Seldin jumps to his feet, seeing a mental flash of the thing beneath the leaves, of the plant-like creature he now understands to be Malnar. That face unsettles him. The eyes, those black, jelly-bean-shaped eyes. Stop! You mean that thing? The thing I saw? Why the hell are we down here? Why are we not fighting? He exclaims, shouting at the Suka. There is nothing left. A concept comes to him. No. He backs away, looking into the sad eyes of his friend. That's not true. I refuse it, he bellows, before darting up the tunnel, leading to the surface. He clenches his mind, forcing out the images the Suka feeds him, in an effort to stop him. Seldin runs as fast as he can. The 5-mile span of the tunnel seems to go on endlessly, until he sees the radiant glow outlining the hatch to the outside. Suddenly he feels exhausted despite the short run. His body grows colder and colder the closer he gets. Placing his hands on the hatch, there's a crystallizing sound and a sudden pain. He jumps back immediately, turning his palms up. The skin is frozen with chunks stuck to the door. Taking a deep breath, he pushes energy to his palms, grabs the hatch, and endures the moment as he forces it. He can feel his heat leaving, smell the chill in the air, as the moisture of his flesh flash freezes from contact with the door. Ah! He howls with all his might. The light from the outside begins to spill in with the cold breeze, and at once the hatch gives way, as he finds himself in a field of icy glass, under the swell of blinding light. The Suka was right. There's nothing left, absolutely nothing, save for the snow that now covers the land, which has been stripped. What could possibly live here now? As the Suka pulls him to safety, Seldin drifts in and out of consciousness. The flesh on his arms, face, and chest is frostbitten to the bone. His breathing becomes labored, and once again he is at the mercy of his wounds. Once back in the den, the Suka sets him on his bed, then retrieves one of the Malnar and places it on him. The roots burrow into him, and as they do, the Suka opens a small hatch, which allows a portion of the brightness to beam in. The flower's petals bloom, drinking in the light. When he finally regains consciousness, Seldin finds himself lying face down in his own crevice, out in the woods. The fading light suggests the day is ending. As he pushes himself to sit up, he feels a presence at the small of his back, and catches sight of the vines enveloping him and the remnants of the fox. Oh God, no! He takes up the withered animal, and then looks to the stone slab, encrusted with pieces of broken glass. He flails in a panic, drops the corpse, and then reaches for the rose attached to the base of his neck. He grasps it, pulls it from himself, and in a fit of rage throws it to the ground. It hits hard, then rights itself as he scrambles for another jar. Pouring out the contents in a hurry, he reacquires the plant and slaps the jar back down on the stone slab, before taking his usual seat across from it. He then weeps for the fox that he didn't want to kill. Leon! Squawks the chilling sound of his mother's ear-piercing voice. Get in here! She shouts through the house to the backyard, where he's practicing. He stops immediately to adhere to her summons and quickly steps inside. The aroma of a peculiar southern herb fills the house, and he knows right away what it is.
Chad tells me you've been out fighting again, beating up on that Almir kid. What did I tell you about that martial arts nonsense?
She scowls, taking a drag from her joint before passing it to Ryan, who takes a puff, then hands it off to Leon's younger brother, Chad. Leon stands there, holding his breath, while offering no reply.
Did you do your chores?
She asks him. Leon makes a face. Yes, he answers, clearing his throat from the smoke.
What about the kitchen?
She prompts. That's on Chad's list, he rebuts. Don't talk back to your mom, Ryan chimes in, and then Sarah takes back the reins.
Well, Chad's in here spending time with his family and not goofing off out back, dancing like some idiot karate bum,
she says. Ryan practices, Leon argues.
He has years of real experience from a real instructor,
says his mother. Didn't help him on the beach, Leon says under his breath. I heard that. Ryan points his two joint-holding fingers at him before handing it off again. You think your friend Seldin knows everything, yet he was too chicken shit to fight me because he knows his so-called skills are crap, and practicing Aether is a waste of time. You're the one who walked away, not him, Leon argues. You and his friends jumped me, Ryan claims. I had to be the bigger man and walk away before somebody got hurt. Sarah looks to her boyfriend, this being the first she's heard of it, then back to her eldest son.
Is that what happened, Leo? You jumped your father?
No, that's bull.
I don't want to hear another word. From now on, you are forbidden to practice that garbage,
she commands. But he's lying, he shouts back.
What did I say?
She gives him a stern look, then points toward the kitchen. Leon grumbles and walks away. He's so fired up he could hit something. He paces in the kitchen like a lion, scouring a cage. Ugh, that woman is so stupid! He snarls angrily at her and the mess of pots on the stove and dishes in the overfilled sink. The energy within him responds to his emotions. He feels hot, and the water in the sink begins to boil. His home life has always been like this, at least ever since his father died. His real father. His mother became a ranting tyrant, and Chad, her little lapdog. Come to think of it, he's not even sure the last time he and Chad did anything that closer resembled being brotherly. As for his mother, it would take a psychiatrist years of regression to find a happy memory. The only good thing in his life this past year has been Seldin. He gave Leon an escape, a way out. Being a guardian is 1,000, no, 1,000,000 times better than being his mother's bitch. In that time after his father's death, and before Seldin came along, Leon severely lacked confidence in himself, and rarely conveyed his own thoughts or stated his own opinions. He was in a slump, but for obvious reasons. The only thing he seemed to care about at the time was the martial arts, and the only one he could learn from was Ryan. But then everything changed for him one day. It was 4 o'clock as Leon waited for the bus to arrive and take him home. He had only been in Florida a few weeks, and Massachusetts was still the home in his mind. As he waited there, practicing his forms in the shade, a teenage boy about his age strolled by, just as he shifted out of a T-stance into a right bow stance. Hey, I know that one, the boy said. Can you do this? He jumped into a one-handed cartwheel, then into a jumping spin kick. No, the young Leon answers, but I can do this. He pointed his hand to the abundance of leaves in the grass. Wind and air, swirl and tease, spin them fast, spin the leaves. The air did just that, swooped down like a miniature cyclone, and spun those loose particles for a short second, before dropping the debris to the ground. Seldin smiled. Cool. Can you do it without the spells? He asked. Leon furrowed a brow. Was that even possible? He wondered. Look. Seldin held out his arms, bathing in the sun. The rustling of the air through the trees grew louder, as the energies around them moved to his core. With a quick turn of his wrist, he opened his palm to the pile of leaves, and blew them away. Leon hadn't seen anything like that before. No one he knew could do it without the words. It's called Aether, Seldin presented. You should come hang out sometime. I'll show you more. He offered happily, and of course, Leon accepted. His friend opened a door for him, with a span of vastly new ideas, strategies, techniques, energy control, and the prospect of being greater. Maybe it was the way Seldin carried himself, or perhaps it was the way Leon carried himself around him. From that day forward, things started to change. Leon couldn't wait to tell everyone about his newfound friend. The smile on his face and the joy in his heart made him glow, but his mother hardly felt the same. Sarah hated Seldin the very moment she set eyes on him. Maybe it was what he stood for, or what he represented, that she despised so much. Or maybe, just maybe, she saw him as a threat that would one day take her boy away from her. Whatever the reason, things grew all the more chaotic at home. Today isn't faring much better. With his anger boiling to its max, he feels something strange, a pull or a tug on him toward the sink, and the faucet. There's a similar sensation coming from the pot of stagnant water, with hot dogs still floating about, coated with a milky white film. Suddenly, there's a whistling sound of steam coming from the faucet. Looking to it, he then hears a rumbling, rolling boil from the stove. Pshhh! The faucet bursts. Leon rushes over to it, fiddling with the knobs to calm the scalding flow, and as his heart shifts from an angered beat to a flutter of concern, the boiling ceases. Right then, the kitchen door opens, with his stepdad popping in. "Yo, Lee," he says in his usual tone as he approaches the teenage boy. "Come on," Leon thinks. "Just give me a reason." His mind races. But then something happens that he didn't expect. Ryan's tone softens. "Listen, your ma and I were talking, and she thinks maybe we'd get along better if we spent some time with each other, like we used to. What do you think?" he asks. This is the moment Leon feels a chance to be blunt. His head sways, as if to answer with his body language. "I don't like you, Ryan," he tells him honestly. "Hey, don't be like that. To be honest, I don't much care for you either. I think you're a smart-ass little punk, to tell you the truth. But for the sake of making this whole," he gestures with his hand, "thing work, I'm willing to be a man and set my personal feelings aside. Why don't you come out with me and my buddies for a night this weekend? We can sit around, have a few drinks, shoot the breeze. Hell, we can even talk martial arts. What do you say?" Leon just huffs with his back to him. There's no way he can replace his father, and surely one night isn't going to make up for the last few years of discord. What would Sai do? He asks himself. 3 days have passed since Seldin's rude awakening. Although his dreams over the last few days have been rather nonchalant, he is once again finding himself on the verge of starvation. Still struggling to catch food, he decides to do the only rational thing any survivalist would, and seek more prosperous grounds. He heads north, following the flow of the stream a few miles up, until coming to the end at the base of the mountain where it disappears, penetrating deep into a narrow crevice, too small for him to pass. "Damn," he huffs, peeking through to the opening of the cave that resides just beyond the wall. It looks as though it could go on for miles. Stepping back, he scans the area and the side of the mountain that bars his path. Well, so much for that. It's too steep to climb, he comments aloud, tugging at a few measly vines that offer little in the way of support. His mind then wanders to childish thoughts, reflecting on the prowess featured in his dreams. He imagines himself back on the plains of the Suka homeworld, where the gravity was weak and his power was strong. "If I were there, I could jump this," he says to himself, envisioning such a feat. Setting his bag down, he steps away from the mountainside, gathers up some courage, pulls some strength, and then goes for it. He builds up speed in a charging run, and then leaps, springing as high as he possibly can. "Yes!" he exclaims. Then suddenly, "Whoa, shit!" He falls back as gravity takes hold, proving to not be his friend, and he slams to the ground, bruising his pride. "Barely even 10 feet, he chuckles, before standing to brush the soreness from his backside and retrieve his bag. Clink! The jar rolls out. He turns a puzzled, unexpecting gaze to the container and the flower that is staring up at him. As he reaches for it, he feels the presence of another mind, much like the one he felt in his dreams. Cringing, he pushes out whatever that feeling is, before grabbing the jar and zipping it securely in his pack. It's obvious he can't go over the mountain, and going around it could take days, a luxury his starving body just doesn't have. The shortest route, he thinks, would be to go through it. The cave that lies beneath the wall must surely go clean to the other side, he figures, for the stream likely wouldn't flow otherwise. He ponders this for a few moments, thinking on just how to manage it. Even with the energy to maximize his strength, he knows he can't punch through the rock, and the power he'd need to pull it off would likely overwhelm his body. He and Simon figured that much out the first year they tapped into the Aether. Although one's ability to will energy is independent of their physical strength, each benefits and augments the other. The more developed the body, the more it can withstand the tidal forces of Aether, and vice versa. Still, everything is about balance, and anything greater than 3 times one's strength could cause the body to rupture as the energy destroys it from within. "There is another option," he whispers under his breath, before placing his hands on the rocky surface at the edge of the small opening. With a deep breath, he focuses his energy into the rock, then continues to breathe at a steady pace, running internal cycles to maintain a constant flow of ether between him and the structure. The wall beneath his hands begins to warm up, and then slowly it steams, turning red. "Gah!" he grunts, for the power feeds back, singeing his hands. Despite the resistance, he can feel the rock weakening, and he pushes harder. "Ah!" Wham! He plunges through, unexpectedly so, as the wall gives way. "I can't believe that worked!" he laughs, relishing in his accomplishment. Dusting himself off, he stands, then peers into the mouth of the vast darkness before him. The stream that cuts through runs along a central path, which meanders into the depths of the cave. He then follows along, exploring until the backlight cast from the outside begins to fade from the winding tunnel. and when the light seems almost completely gone, he gapes at the scintillating beauty of the star-like speckles that glisten like glitter in all directions, creating an almost twilight effect while casting a radiant blue luster over the cave walls. It's peaceful there, tranquil, and as he marches on, he comes upon a basin, a pocket of water about the size of a backyard swimming pool. The crystal-clear water darkens in the depths to blackness. Above the pond clings a large protrusion, a stalactite perhaps. He can't really see it, given the poor visibility. "I need more light," he comments, before cupping his right hand as he concentrates. He can feel a strange pull all around him, adding resistance to the ether he draws in. As the energy forms into an orb of light, it jumps, leaping off as if sucked away by the structure beside him. Startled, his gaze follows it to a large crystal, before it bounces off to the next, ricocheting around the cave. The orb bounces from crystal to crystal, leaving dimly glowing stalks behind, until it cuts across his path, striking him forcibly in the shoulder and knocking him flat. The energy dissipates on impact, illuminating the cave as it vanishes, absorbed by the crystalline formations lining the walls. The cave then grows cold and dark once again. "Ugh," Seldin howls as he sits up, flicking at some broken shards of crystal. "That explains the feeling in here. These things are screwing with my aura." He then kips up, leaving his bag at his feet, as he moves around the edge of the basin to get a better view of the enormous body draping down from the ceiling, now known to be crystal. Reaching out toward it, he concentrates a steady stream of energy to the colorful formation of quartz, which absorbs his power without resistance. After a moment or two, the large crystal begins to glow rather brightly. His eyes then widen at the sight of thousands and thousands of jagged stalks protruding from the walls. Blue, purple clear, and white hues shimmer like a rainbow in the light. Now that's cool. And then, as he glances down, his heart leaps in his chest. "Food!" he exclaims, diving into the water, giving chase to the enormous fish that school in a place that no human has ever been. With a gasp, he splashes his head out from the surface to catch his breath and hoist a flopping feast to the rocky shore of his new dwelling. Utilizing the same trick he had to light the cave, he heats up a collection of stones to cook the fish. As he prepares everything, he goes about setting up a camping spot, complete with a sleeping bag, a clothesline, and of course, his friend. Before he knows it, dinner is ready, and he takes that first mouth-watering bite. He savors the moment with a flood of endorphins, the brain's natural reward for a successful hunt. Still, as his stomach grows all the more satisfied, he finds himself uneasy in the moment. "I realize I have to," he says softly, glancing to the flower. "And even though it doesn't have a cute face or soft fur, it still bothers me. What about its life? If I hadn't strolled in here, it would still be alive. Yet without it, I should surely perish. There has to be another way, Lucy." He glances to the extraterrestrial flower. "To preserve life, without destroying it." He sighs, closing his tired eyes to the fading light overhead, and for the first night in almost 2 weeks, Seldin nods off with a full stomach.